This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace.
Anytime I post an image on my Instagram account where I've been out doing some street photography and someone appears in an image of mine who's recognizable, you can see who they are, I get the same barrage of questions underneath. Things like, did you get permission? Is this legal to do? What about GDPR? Did you need a model release? Does posting this image on your Instagram account count as publishing? I think it's clear that there's a lot of confusion amongst photographers about what is okay and what's not okay to do legally when you're out taking photographs of people on the street. So I've decided to make this video to plow through some of the frequently asked questions, hopefully break down some of the misconceptions and leave you better informed at the end of it. Now, I'm no expert about this stuff, so I contacted the AOP, the Association of Photographers, and asked them if they would be willing to sit down and answer some of these questions for us. The Association of Photographers are an organization who help photographers with legal advice, how to drop contracts, how to go about the business part of their work, and to get their work out there. So they're really well positioned to know all the laws when it comes to what is okay and what's not okay with street photography. Now, obviously, most of their advice is going to be specific to UK law, but I did also take some time to ask about Germany and the US, because it seems from my Instagram when I post these images that it's you guys who are most concerned and confused about what's okay and what's not. For those of you who live somewhere else in the world, I'm sure you'll find this information useful, but you probably will need to take that extra step to check what the laws are locally where you live. So without procrastinating any further, let's head through to the AOP.
My name's Nick Dunmur, and I'm the Business and Legal Advisor for the Association of Photographers, as well as being a professional photographer. The AOP is a trade association for professional photographers. It stands for the Association of Photographers, unsurprisingly enough, and it was formed in 1968. So we have pro photographers as our core membership, but we also have other membership categories for students, for example, for people who are starting out in the industry, which is an access membership, and also for assistants. So we have an assisting photographer membership as well. And we do business events, so you might hear a little bit of noise in the background, which is we're actually filming this at one of those business days now. So which is kind of, you know, a bunch of speakers getting together, talking about problems that we all face, marketing, how to get in touch with clients, how to build a portfolio, whether you need an agent or not, that kind of stuff. So we do a lot of that kind of activity. Our key goal is probably supporting professional practice and that kind of thing. And what I do is provide the sort of business and legal support. Although I'm not a lawyer, I have to state that from the outset. But I do work with lawyers, and I work a lot with intellectual property. Right, in the UK, you can photograph, if you're in a public place, and there is that important caveat, I'll come to that in a bit, but if you're in a public place, you can photograph anything. Okay, there is no law that prevents you or prohibits you from photographing anybody or anything. It's what you do with the pictures that is the important thing. So, the caveat that I said earlier, the public place, it's surprising what people think is public that turns out not to be public, and I'll give you an example. If you are on the embankment side, the South Bank side of the River Thames, for example, near Tower Bridge, you can walk along that huge wide walkway quite comfortably. It's several metres wide, there's loads of people toing and froing up and down all there. But what you don't realise is that the private property for each of those businesses that backs onto that walkway, and they're mostly restaurants and bars and that kind of thing, the private property bit extends further than you think. So you could set up, or you could be taking photographs on something that you think is public property, public space, public property, and actually you're on somebody's private land. That's part of their business, and you might get moved on depending on what you're doing. If you set a tripod up, if you set lights up or something like that. Obviously with street photography, you're not going to be doing that kind of thing. You're going to be walking around, so you're less likely to get challenged. But that's quite a good example of where, you know, what appears to be public is actually private. Canary Wharf, another example, the whole of that space is private property, that's privately owned, even though you've got right of access to go across between tube stations to get to paths, crossroads, all that kind of stuff. It's actually sort of a private estate. And you notice that, you know, when you're walking through a space like that, the security guards are all Canary Wharf security. It's got a slightly different feel about it. And there's lots of different spaces, particularly in big capital cities, you know, not just London, but other spaces, shopping centres, for example. You know, another area where actually if you're inside a shopping centre and you're making photographs, the likelihood is you could be challenged by a security guard because you're on private property. As far as buildings are concerned, yes, there are some that are trademarked, and for commercial use, that's going to be a problem where you're going to need to get clearance, rights clearance from the trademark owner, basically. So something like the Gherkin, for example, that's quite a commonly sort of referenced building where, yes, if you want to use that as a commercial thing, you're going to need to get particular rights clearances for that. Buildings have, I mean, they do have copyright protection, but it's not an infringement to make a photograph of those. That's part of the copyright legislation, part of the Copyright Designs and Patents Act, is that you can make a photograph of a building without infringing the copyright in that building. So as far as the law is concerned, you can photograph anybody if you're in public. So, you know, given previous caveat, if you're in public, you can photograph anybody. There is no law that prevents you, and that includes children. Now, whether that's right or wrong is another different question that we'll come to later. But yes, you can photograph anybody. What you do with the imagery that you've got as a street photographer, you go out, you make a bunch of pictures, you do some edits, you've got a body of work that you're kind of starting to build on. The use of those pictures is what governs how far you can how can you use them? So whether you use them for commercial use, and that is a word that's slightly difficult to define exactly, but generally speaking, and that's important, generally speaking, it's about the promotion of a product, service or brand. So that's quite a useful sort of short definition of what commercial use would entail. So if you're using a street photograph to promote a product, service or brand, that would be classed as commercial use. Now, you could extend that to promotion of your own business. So if you're running yourself as a professional photography business, it's not just you as a photographer who's interested in making artwork or commenting on the human condition or making bodies of work for your own pleasure, for example, or communicating it through exhibition. If you're then actively promoting that on your website for your own brand or product or service, you might be straying into a commercial use definition as well. So it's well to be slightly careful with that. So the line between the sort of your artistic use and your commercial use, if you're a photographer trying to promote your own business, generally speaking, and I think, you know, there are some caveats, and if you're in any doubt, you know, get legal advice. Don't rely on sort of hearsay and what you see. But if you're using photographs that you've made on the street as part of an exhibition, that's part of your own artistic practice. So that's okay. If you wanted to sell prints from that exhibition, generally speaking, that would be okay too. If you wanted to sell a copy of a book that you'd self-published from that exhibition, generally speaking, that's okay as well. If you're getting people to sort of publish the book for you, or you're using the work in a broader context that's more about promoting your business practice maybe more broadly than promoting that exhibition specifically, then that's where the boundaries starts to get a bit more blurry, and you probably, you know, you need to think a bit more carefully about that. I'm sure everybody's heard of GDPR, you know, the General Data Protection Regulation, and its impact on things like street photography, because that's kind of, a lot of people, when that was first implemented, were really concerned about the effect on their ability to go out and make pictures on the street. Truth be told, it shouldn't affect your ability to make pictures. Well, it doesn't affect your ability to make the pictures. And actually the definition of personal data is such that even in reference to a photograph, it really needs to be accompanied by some other identifying data for it to be classed as personal data, because a picture of a person on their own with nothing else, no metadata, no caption, no tags in the image that give any clue as to who that person is. It's just simply an anonymous person. The GDPR regulation has two exceptions, the artistic use exception and the journalistic use exception, and they allow people to make photographs for artistic uses basically, and that could be for exhibition. You're making a body of work that's commenting on, as I've said before, something about the human condition, as opposed to going out to make pictures of people to sell for stock library use or something like that. You know, that would be an overtly commercial activity. Going back sort of, you know, right before this legislation was even in place, it wasn't the intent of the people that were drafting the legislation to go, let's put a stop to street photography. That's not what they intended. And I think lots of people are really worried about, oh, you know, I can't ever make a street photograph ever again. You know, that was not the intention of the legislators to do that. Okay, if you're making photographs and you want to use them commercially, you need to get permission and you need to get it in writing. It's no good having somebody say, yeah, that's fine, and you've just got a conversation. So whatever you do, make sure it's in writing. There are two types of consent, if you like, that you can get off people. One is more robust than the other, and I would always recommend if your aim is to get this photograph to sell, to be used commercially, to promote somebody else's product or brand or service or whatever, you want a proper contractual model release, not a consent form. The difference being that there is a contract in the contractual model release, as the name implies, that's between you and the person you're photographing, and that outweighs everything else to do with data protection. So you've got, there are three elements to a contract. There's an offer, there's acceptance, there's consideration. So you need to pay something or give something of value for that to be a binding contract, and that might be something like a print. You say, well, you know, I'm going to give you a couple of prints from this. They might be worth £5 each, 10 quid each, whatever that might be. Or you might pay them something. It doesn't have to be the going rate for a model. You might pay them a quid, you might pay them 5 quid, you might pay them a tenner, but something of value. That's the key part to making that contract work. And that is a much better route to follow rather than just getting a consent form which is softer. And because of GDPR, somebody who gives their consent can now revoke their consent, which might create problems later on down the line. If somebody goes, actually, I'm not happy with my picture being used in this way, I'm going to get in touch with the photographer and I'm going to say I've changed my mind, I want to be, you know, all record of that image taken off, destroyed, blah, 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 or certainly I'm revoking my consent for you to use that image, etc., all of that kind of thing. So a contractual model release form is what you need, absolutely, if you're going to be using those pictures for any sort of overt commercial use. Our data protection law is pretty much the same across the EU. Germany has, from what I know, and I'm not an expert in the law in Germany, but I do know that it has a greater breadth of privacy law, which can affect how imagery is used. Now, and I also know that there have been 3 cases, I think, that have been attempted to be brought in Germany to do with this, where people have been photographed in public spaces, they've seen the work being used as part of an exhibition, and they've objected and they've tried to file a claim against the photographer on the basis of an invasion of privacy, because the privacy law is tighter. However, none of those, to my knowledge, have succeeded, because the photographer making the imagery was clearly in a public space. There was not a reasonable expectation of privacy as far as where that activity was taking place, so there's no claim to be brought. But it is true that German privacy law and French privacy law actually are both tighter, deeper, more broad than we have in the UK. So as far as the United States is concerned, it's actually quite a lot freer in terms of making pictures, but there's an important caveat to that, and that is there are 2 levels of legislation at work in the States. You've got federal law, which is across the whole country, and then you've got, confusingly, different sets of state law, and they can vary quite widely. If you're confronted after you've made a photograph of somebody and somebody's spotted you taking their picture, they come storming over, what the hell do you think you're doing, you know, demand that you delete that picture immediately, etc., or that you don't have the right to take it. I think the first thing is you're nice, you know, don't get aggressive. Stay calm, stay cool. You haven't done anything illegal. assuming you're in a public space, you've made a picture of somebody, that's all that's happened so far. You know, you've not sold that picture instantly at that point, you've just made a photograph, that's all. People are really sort of worried, I think, overly worried about what an image is going to suddenly be used for. They think it's going to be on the internet in seconds, and I think if you're just calm and you take some time to explain what you're doing, you might be working on a piece of work about this, that or the other, you know, you're in the middle of making a body of work about something, you might just be taking photographs for yourself because you like photography and you want to go out and street photography is your thing. You know, you do that as a form of therapy or as a form of that's what you do to relax. You could show the person who's challenged you, you could show them the image. I think first off, I wouldn't go down that road unless you absolutely have to, because depending on what the image is that you've made, they may not like it. And if you've shown them, and they don't like it, you've kind of given them an extra reason to ask you to delete it. Because it might be more about the composition, shadow, chiaroscuro, light and shade, shape, form, all of that kind of stuff. And they may be a really small part of it. Or you might be sort of trying to do a Bruce Gilden and you're wandering around with a 28mm or a 15mm or something and really getting in people's faces. And with that, they might not be quite so pleased about how they're represented. I think, ultimately, we're all sort of occupying this space together. To me, that's more important that you get on with your fellow human beings as opposed to prioritising your photography at all costs over and above that. So I think you stay calm, be friendly, be personable, be approachable, try and just take the wind out of their sails and reassure them that you're not after their soul. It's kind of, you've just got a nice street photograph.
Anything I want to add?
The only thing that I would add is that I am not a lawyer. I've got a lot of experience with copyright, with data protection, with advising photographers and supporting photographers in professional practice. So what I would say is that if you're unsure about any aspect of that and you think you want to use something for commercial use, then maybe that thought process should happen at the beginning of your photography or when you're planning your photography and not afterwards, because it's really difficult to track somebody down and try and get permission after the event.
So that's the legal side of things, and I hope that's given you some solid information, but there's also the ethical side of things to consider. I think long before we hit the boundaries of the law, we need to make ethical decisions for ourselves. So we're not talking about taking photos that will break the law. We're way before that deciding what photographs should I take and shouldn't I take based on ethical boundaries we set up for ourselves. And let me just say that ethics are a very subjective matter. They're very personal to individuals. And I'm going to share some of my boundaries I set up for myself with you. But it's with the understanding that they're not to be copied and pasted by you. You have to make up your own mind. For some, my boundaries will be way too liberal, and for some, they'll be way too conservative. You need to make decisions for yourself. One of my boundaries is that I won't take photographs of people in a vulnerable situation. So somebody who's homeless, I won't take a recognizable photograph of that person. Someone who's lying, passed out, drunk in the street, I won't take that photograph, I'll walk past. These are just decisions for myself. It's not to say that those photographs shouldn't be taken. I think there are absolutely use cases where stories need to be told and those shots need to be taken, but for me, that's one of my ethical boundaries. Another boundary I have is I don't want to degrade anyone with a photograph I take. I don't want to take an unkind photograph, and that's sometimes an easy thing to do. I want photographs I take to celebrate people and not to make them look bad. That's again not to say that those photographs shouldn't be taken, and some people do that to tell very important stories, and that's great. But for me personally, I try and shy away from that. And that's not to say that there isn't a situation where I need to take that photograph to tell the story, but I always have in mind how kind or unkind is the photograph that I'm taking. Another boundary I set up for myself is I don't want to leer with my images. I don't want to sexualize somebody in my photographs who's just going about their day in public. I think men in particular need to be careful about photographing women, and I try and get as honest with myself as I possibly can about why I'm taking a particular photograph and what drew me to that subject in the first place. And if I'm not totally comfortable with my motives, I won't take the shot. Another boundary I have for myself is usually if someone sees me taking their shot and asks me to delete that photograph, I'll delete it. And again, this is a really personal boundary I've set up for myself. We've already discussed that if you can legally take that photograph, you're within your rights to do so. But I feel like no single shot I take is worth ruining someone else's day. Now again, these are my ethical boundaries I've set up for myself. The point is that you go out and make decisions about your ethical boundaries that you want to put in place for your own work. And they can change over time, they can morph, they should do if you're growing. And it's going to be based on your view of the world, and you're going to have to enforce it with your integrity. It's also a waste of time to go around criticizing other photographers' ethical codes just because they don't agree with yours. They are subjective, leave them to do their work. If they're not breaking the law, you don't really have a right to criticize. Stick to your ethical boundaries, stay in your lane, stick to your code. At the end of the day, as my friend Joshua Jackson always says, it comes down to intent. If you're challenged for taking any particular photograph on the street, you should be able to honestly back up your intention. You can follow all the legal rules, but still take an unkind photograph, which you know, if you're honest with yourself, is going to be very hard to defend. And at that point, I don't think saying, well, it's within my legal rights to take this shot is good enough. So I think it's time really well spent if you sit down before you head out to work out, what is my ethical code? What photographs am I okay with taking and what am I not okay with taking? And then even while we're shooting, to be constantly assessing within myself, what is my intent for taking this photograph and am I comfortable with it? So I hope this video has left you better informed about the law when it comes to street photographers, and also got you thinking about putting together your own ethical code. And I want to thank the AOP so much for taking the time to sit down with me. If you want to see more of what they do and the service that they offer to professional photographers, I'm going to leave a link down below so you can go and check them out. And thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a domain or a website, they're a great all-in-one option. I've used them myself for 8 or 9 years now for all my professional work. One of the great things about their platform, especially for photographers, is how beautiful they make your work look. They have a great selection of templates that are beautifully, minimally designed, so your images do the talking. And they have gallery pages which are really quick to set up, to put in your navigation, and just to click and drag in your images. And all the images you drag in will get resized and served up to somebody on a mobile phone small so it loads fast, or on a website big and luscious so it makes your images look great.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.